right, welcome back to this Thursday edition of Focal Point, AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name, your congenial, convivial, and amiable host. As always, the program is Focal Point, the home of muscular Christianity on conservative talk radio, and the network is the American Family Radio Talk Network. Now, let's grab clip 1, and let's have clips 2 and 3 ready to roll right behind that. You're aware that the George Zimmerman trial, closing arguments being presented today in this trial, and this trial never even should have happened. The fact that George Zimmerman is even on trial and is facing second-degree murder charges all by itself, that is a travesty, an utter miscarriage of justice, because this whole issue is not about justice. It is about race. And one of the striking things, I'm looking at a piece here by Russell Simmons, who I think is kind of a hip-hop recording exec, something like that. It's involved somehow in the music industry, maybe rap music industry, whatever. And he posted a blog yesterday. Huffington Post has a copy of it. And remember, and I'll play a soundbite here from the police chief in Sanford, Florida, said, look, basically I was forced to arrest George Zimmerman. We looked at it. We investigated it. It was clear to us that this was a case of justifiable self-defense. Wasn't even a stand your ground case. This was just self-defense. He's being attacked by somebody that's bigger, that's pummeling him, that has him on the ground, that's beating his head on the pavement. And according to George Zimmerman, he thought that Trayvon Martin was going for his gun. And so the sheriff said, look, this seemed clearly to us to be an instance of self-defense. We saw no reason to charge this guy. And he actually wound up getting fired because he would not arrest George Zimmerman, because he would not violate his oath of office. He said, look, I took an oath. I took an oath to uphold the law and to see that justice was done and that justice was administered fairly. And I could not arrest George Zimmerman without violating my oath of office. So he got fired. He says, my conscience is clear. It destroyed a dream for me. My dream had been to be a police chief in the town in which I grew up. That dream was realized when he became the police chief in Sanford. That was cut short. So he's a second victim of injustice in this circumstance. And everybody in Florida is gearing up now for race riots if George Zimmerman is acquitted, which he almost certainly should be. Now, this Russell Simmons, just to give you an idea that this is not about justice, it's about race. He says this in his blog post: whether George Zimmerman is found innocent or guilty by the jury, I am a firm believer that all of us live by karmic law, and he will ultimately be punished for the death of Trayvon, no matter what. And then he says at the very end of his blog post, never will we stop fighting for justice for Trayvon, guilty verdict or acquittal, as our work will never be done. So again, you notice here that he's saying, look, our battle for racial justice, it's never going to be over. There's never going to be a time when we're going to say, you know, we're where we ought to be when it comes to racism. We have vanquished racism. We have vanquished slavery. Everybody has equal rights regardless of race, color, or creed in this country. And they say we're never going to get to the place where we will accept that some kind of parity, some kind of justice, some kind of place has been reached where some of these issues at least have been brought under control. So we're never going to admit that. We're always going to make race an issue. We're always going to be pushing the issue of race, and we're never going to stop fighting for Trayvon. Even if he is acquitted, we believe he's going to be subject to karmic justice, and he's going to be punished. In other words, in our mind, George Zimmerman is guilty and has got to pay a price. Now, you have people out there reading that, and they're going to say, look, well, if the jury isn't going to get justice for Trayvon Martin, then we've got to take justice into our own hands. And more indication, let's play clip number 1 from Alan Dershowitz. He's a Harvard law professor. This guy leans way to the left. He was on Steve Malzberg's radio program. So here's a guy, here's an uber leftist. I mean, you cannot get further to the left than Alan Dershowitz. If you turned left from where Alan Dershowitz is, you'd wind up going around in circles and meeting yourself. That's how far left this guy is. So if anybody's in a position to want to find George Zimmerman guilty, I mean, his bias personally would be to find George Zimmerman guilty, to punish the white Hispanic for the death of the black attacker. But he says, look, I'm looking at the evidence in this case. I've been following it. And here's what he told Steve Malzberg on his program yesterday.
I would say there's reasonable doubt. I would say nobody knows who started the initial fight. Remember, it's monumentally irrelevant who's morally guilty here, whether or not Zimmerman was a racist and racially profiled and shouldn't have been doing it and didn't listen to the police. That's all irrelevant under Florida law. The case begins when the first blow is struck, essentially. And we don't know who struck the first blow. Well, we don't know if Trayvon Martin came out from behind a dark area and jumped him and got him down. And as long as we don't know that, we don't know whose voice it was who was yelling, help me, help me, that's reasonable doubt. Most Americans deep down don't believe in reasonable doubt. What they say is, we got to figure out who did it.
Right.
We're scientists. This is CSI. At the end of CSI, you know who did it, who didn't do it. That's not what a criminal trial is about. If you think it's 60% likely or 70% or even 80% likely that Zimmerman is guilty and doesn't deserve self-defense, you have to acquit.
So that's Alan Dershowitz. Basically, I'd find Zimmerman not guilty. The prosecution has not met the burden of proof here. Now, here's a soundbite, clip number 2. This is Police Chief Bill Lee, lengthy interview with CNN. He lost his job over this. He was fired because he would not violate his oath of office, would not violate his conscience by arresting George Zimmerman, because their investigation, they determined that this was a justifiable case of self-defense, and therefore no charges were appropriate in this case. And so he's being interviewed by the reporter, George Howell of CNN. And here's just one excerpt of their lengthy conversation where he's asked about looking back on what happened. Would you have done anything differently? Here's how it went.
When you look back at what happened, was there a lot of pressure on you to make an arrest?
There was pressure applied. The city manager asked several times during the process, can an arrest be made now? And I think that was just from not understanding the process, the criminal justice process. I had one of the city commissioners come to me on 2 different occasions and say, all we want is an arrest. And I explained to them, well, you just can't do that. You have to have probable cause to arrest somebody. And it was related to me that they just wanted an arrest. They didn't care if it got dismissed later. And you don't do that.
So he's saying, look, I had an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. I could not have arrested George Zimmerman without violating his Fourth Amendment rights. And he said, look, I had a solemn oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. I wasn't going to violate my oath. I wasn't going to violate my conscience just to bend to all this political pressure. But there was this tremendous political pressure, and we're finding out now, this story came out yesterday. I had it in the stack yesterday. Didn't have time to get to it. But Judicial Watch filed a Freedom of Information request with the Justice Department. They launched an investigation into this Trayvon Martin case because they had gotten reports, credible reports, that the Department of Justice, Eric Holder, had actually sent a secret team. They called them peacekeepers, but they're agitators. That the Department of Justice, Eric Holder, had sent a secret team of community agitators down to Sanford, Florida, to stir up trouble, to agitate racial unrest. This is coming out of the Department of Justice. Remember now the statue of Lady Justice. She's got a blindfold over her eyes so she cannot see. She can't see skin color. She can't see anything else but just the facts of the case. That's why she's got scales in her hands to weigh the evidence and to render a verdict that's based on justice, doesn't have anything to do with superficial characteristics like skin color. Well, for this Department of Justice, it is all about skin color. And so the Department of Justice, Eric Holder, actually sent a team. These so-called peacekeepers are part of a large and growing division within the Department of Justice called the Community Relations Service, CRS. Though CRS purports to spot and quell racial tensions nationwide before they arise, the documents obtained by Judicial Watch show the group actively worked to foment unrest, spending thousands of taxpayer dollars on travel and hotel rooms to train protesters throughout Florida. So they were not about justice. They weren't even about peace. Even though they call themselves peacekeepers, they were down there to disturb the peace. They were down there to foment and to create unrest. And here's some of the information that came right from the Department of Justice from their own documents. These peacekeepers, these community agitators, spent $1,143 to travel to Sanford, Florida from March 25 to 28 in 2012 to work, quote, to work marches, demonstrations, and rallies. Here's a second entry. They spent $751.60 from March 30 to April 1, quote, to provide technical assistance to the city of Sanford, event organizers. Who are that? Those are community agitators, race baiters, and law enforcement agencies for the march and rally. So they're helping to organize this march against George Zimmerman. Here's another entry. CRS employees spent $1,300.40 from April 3 to April 12, quote, to provide technical assistance, conciliation, and on-site mediation during demonstrations. Now, here's some more information. On April 15, during the height of the protest, the Orlando Sentinel reported, that's the CRS, these community agitators sent by Eric Holder, supposed to be the Department of Justice, they helped set up a meeting between the local NAACP and elected officials that led to the temporary resignation of Police Chief Bill Lee. He wound up getting his job back, and then he got fired finally for good, according to Turner Clayton. Separately, Judicial Watch also obtained an audio recording of a community meeting. Employees with the CRS had arranged a 40-mile police escort for students from Daytona Beach just to go to Sanford to disturb the peace and foment unrest. Focal Point, AFR Talk, back in 2.